The fluorescent lights hummed above the surgical prep unit at St. Michael's in Savannah, a sound like distant machinery that never quite stopped. Katie Morrison's hands moved across the instrument tray with mechanical precision, arranging scalpels and forceps in spacing so exact it looked rehearsed. Each blade caught the overhead light. Each clamp sat exactly where it needed to be. No variation. No wasted motion. The antiseptic smell burned sharp in the cold air, a chemical bite that had become her baseline oxygen. She kept her eyes on her work. This was the strategy that had kept her alive for the past 4 months: move deliberately, speak rarely, take up as little space as possible. The surgical prep unit at 7 in the morning was quieter than the trauma bays would be by noon, and she preferred it that way. No crowds. No audience. Just the rhythmic clink of stainless steel and the whisper of her scrub sleeves sliding across the work surface. The sleeves of her scrubs were slightly too long. She'd chosen them that way, even though the hospital supplied standard sizes. The extra fabric concealed the surgical scars that mapped the inside of her left forearm like topographic lines, marks from field medicine under fire in Ramadi, marks from hands that had held things together when there was nothing else to hold them with. Her right wrist carried similar terrain, thin white lines that could tell a story if anyone knew how to read them. But nobody read her hands. Nobody looked closely enough at Katie Morrison, the quiet nurse from the day shift who ate lunch alone in the break room. She moved to the next tray, checking the surgical instruments for Colonel James Morrison scheduled in room 312 at 8:45. The name made her jaw tighten for just a fraction of a second, a micro-expression she buried immediately. Colonel James Morrison was her son's commanding officer. He'd served alongside Thomas in the 75th Ranger Regiment before an IED near Sanjin Valley had taken her son's left leg and most of his hearing in his left ear. The colonel had been there. He'd carried Thomas through the blast radius. He'd called her, his voice steady and careful, telling her that her son was alive and that he'd personally ensure Thomas got the best prosthetics the military could provide. That conversation had been 3 years ago. Thomas walked on a carbon fiber limb now and worked in software development. He didn't talk much about the valley anymore. Katie had requested this assignment specifically. The computer system showed it as coincidence, a routine case selection algorithm. It wasn't. She'd seen the colonel's name on the surgical schedule 6 weeks ago and had made a quiet request to her charge nurse that she be assigned to his prep and recovery. The charge nurse, a woman named Diane, had marked it down without asking questions. Everyone at St. Michael's was careful around Katie Morrison. Careful and distant. The door to the prep unit opened. Dr. Pierce entered, clipboard in hand, moving through the morning briefing with the posture of a man who owned the space. He was tall, mid-50s, with the kind of face that had never experienced genuine consequence. Grey threaded through his hair in a way he probably considered distinguished. His white coat was immaculate. Everything about him spoke of a man accustomed to being obeyed. He moved toward the instrument trays, observing Katie's work without commenting. His eyes were calculating, the eyes of a man always measuring angles. He stopped beside her, close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath, close enough that she could see the Rolex on his wrist, a watch that cost more than Katie made in 6 months. She kept her gaze on the tray in front of her, arranging a set of hemostatic clamps with absolute focus. "The Morrison case," Pierce said. His voice carried the casual authority of someone who'd never experienced contradiction. "Room 312. You're prepping?" Katie's response came in the deferential tone she'd perfected over 4 months. "Yes, doctor. All instruments accounted for. Surgical site verification checklist complete. Anesthesia consult is scheduled for 7:45. Pierce studied the tray, his expression revealing nothing. He was looking for something, she could sense it in the way his eyes tracked the layout of instruments. He was noticing her precision, the way every item sat in exact alignment, every tray configured for maximum efficiency. She'd been a captain in special forces, trained in field surgery, trained in operating in conditions where one wasted second meant someone died. This hospital work was simpler than Ramadi. Simpler and infinitely more constrained. "Meticulous," Pierce said finally. It wasn't complimentary. It was observational. He set down his clipboard and tapped a finger on the charting sheet beside her. Your documentation flagged a discrepancy in surgical supply ordering for this unit. Katie's hands didn't pause. She was checking hemostatic clamps now, verifying each one against the surgical protocol. The supply logs show a variance in the equipment vendor's weekly deliveries. The discrepancy appeared in my charting 3 weeks ago when I was cross-referencing inventory counts against the actual surgical usage. This was the moment. She could feel it. She'd flagged something she shouldn't have flagged, an inconsistency in the billing that didn't match the inventory. She didn't know the full scope of what she'd seen yet, but she knew enough to understand that the discrepancy was deliberate. Someone in the supply chain was skimming, and her obsessive charting, the same habit that had kept soldiers alive in the valley, had caught the ghost of it. Pierce's jaw tightened for less than a second. It was the same micro-expression Katie had just caught in her own reflection. Concern. Calculation. That variance is administrative, he said, his voice taking on a cooler edge. Not the responsibility of nursing staff. Understood, Doctor. Katie returned her attention to the instruments. This was the correct response. Acknowledge, accept, move on. Don't push. Don't question. Don't become memorable. But Pierce was still watching her. She could feel the weight of his attention like a change in air pressure. He was reassessing something. She'd become visible to him in a way she hadn't been before, and visibility was the one thing Katie Morrison could not afford. Visibility meant scrutiny. Scrutiny meant discovery. Discovery meant that the careful civilian life she'd constructed in Savannah would collapse like a building demolished from the inside. The door to the prep unit opened again. 2 other nurses came in, both in their late 20s, both carrying the casual ease of people who belonged in every space they entered. Sarah and Marcus, the unit's day shift staff. They moved toward the coffee station near the back corner of the prep area without looking in Katie's direction. This was the coordination that had become routine over her 4 months of employment. When Katie entered a room, other nurses eventually left it. When she sat in the break room at lunch, the occupied tables emptied and reformed elsewhere. It wasn't hostile exactly. It was methodical. It was exile executed with the precision of a military maneuver. She understood the mechanism. Dr. Pierce had made it clear through dozens of subtle signals that Katie Morrison was not part of the unit's social structure. And the other staff members, reading those signals with the instinctive accuracy of people navigating institutional hierarchies, had adjusted accordingly. You didn't sit with the person the attending physician had already decided was deficient. You didn't extend camaraderie to someone whose competence he questioned. You adapted and survived. Katie had adapted to worse. Pierce left the prep unit, his clipboard tucked under one arm. The fluorescent lights hummed on. Sarah and Marcus moved through their morning routine at the opposite end of the room, speaking to each other in the low voices of people who'd worked together long enough to communicate with minimal language. Katie continued her preparation for Colonel Morrison's surgery, her hands moving with the same measured precision that had served her through 17 years of military service and 4 months of civilian translation. The surgical instruments were ready at 7:30. She'd checked them twice, then a third time, following a protocol that even the most meticulous civilian nurse would have considered excessive. But Katie had learned in Ramadi that you could never be too careful. She'd held a young Marine with a sucking chest wound on her lap while waiting for a surgical team that wouldn't arrive for another 8 minutes. She'd used her fingers to maintain pressure on a child's femoral artery after an IED blast had torn through a marketplace. She'd performed an emergency field thoracotomy with a combat knife when there was nothing else available, opening a man's chest to relieve tension pneumothorax while bullets kicked up dust around them. Compared to that, arranging surgical instruments in a climate-controlled hospital felt like meditation. But that wasn't the worst part. That wasn't the real danger that had started the moment Dr. Pierce's eyes had focused on her charting. The danger wasn't Pierce himself. He was just a man with a comfortable corruption that probably netted him $30,000 a month in kickbacks from the equipment vendor. The real danger was what happened when people like Pierce felt threatened. They didn't escalate rationally. They didn't follow linear patterns. They weaponized institutions against the person who'd become inconvenient, and they did it with the focused precision of predators who'd never encountered genuine resistance. Katie understood this because she'd studied predators. She'd hunted them through the streets of Ramadi with a designated marksman rifle and a 6-man team. She'd learned how they moved, how they chose targets, how they adapted when tactics failed. And she'd learned that the most dangerous predator was always the one who had no concept that his prey might bite back. At 7:55, she moved Colonel Morrison's prepared instruments into the operating theater. The surgical team was assembling, 2 residents, the attending anesthesiologist, surgical nurses already gowned and gloved, their movements synchronized from years of choreography. Katie positioned herself where she belonged, at the periphery, supporting, precise, invisible. The colonel was being wheeled in on a stretcher, prepped for a vascular procedure that would take approximately 40 minutes. His eyes found hers as he was positioned on the surgical table, and something in his gaze shifted. Recognition, maybe. Or something deeper, the acknowledgement that passes between people who've stood in the proximity of death and understood what it meant. She held his gaze for just a moment longer than protocol required. That was all. One moment. But that moment carried the weight of 4 months of kept silence, of invisible labor, of a woman who'd once led men through impossible terrain and was now arranging instruments in a surgical prep unit while wearing a name tag and trying very hard not to exist. Katie Morrison stepped back from the table. The procedure was about to begin. The attending physician signaled the anesthesiologist. The surgical team moved in synchronized precision. And in the back office, Dr. Pierce was already opening a word processing document. His fingers moved across the keyboard with the casual authority of a man who understood that institutional power had nothing to do with truth and everything to do with documentation. He was drafting her first disciplinary notice. The offense would be trivial, improper instrument handling, a fabrication that no one would question because who contradicted the attending physician. The notice would be printed and posted on the unit bulletin board where everyone could see. This was how predators worked. One strike. Then another. Then another. Until the prey was either gone or so thoroughly damaged that resistance became impossible. But Dr. Pierce had no idea who he was stalking. Morning rounds moved like clockwork through Colonel Morrison's room. The family gathered at the foot of the bed, daughter on the left, son in marine dress blues on the right, their eyes tracking every movement. Dr. Pierce entered with his chart held high, his presence commanding the space the way he always did, and Katie stood just behind the instrument tray, her hands positioned exactly as protocol demanded. She'd prepared this setup 17 minutes earlier, every instrument sterile, every sequence documented in her meticulous charting that nobody read but everybody noticed. "Nurse Morrison," Pierce said, his voice carrying the weight of an announcement. He lifted the tray with 2 fingers as if it smelled. "Once again, we have improper sterilization sequencing that could have contaminated the entire surgical field. This is exactly the kind of carelessness that puts patients at risk." He turned to Colonel Morrison's daughter. "This is why we have protocols, you see. Field hospital standards don't translate to civilian medicine." Katie's jaw tightened. Just a single muscle contraction at the hinge. Nobody would have noticed unless they were looking for it. Her hands remained steady on her clipboard. She continued logging vitals on the chart in front of her, blood pressure 118/74, heart rate 62, oxygen saturation 98%, her pen moving with mechanical precision. She said nothing. The silence stretched. Pierce waited for a response that never came, and something flickered across his face, a small frustration that he masked with a smile directed at Morrison's daughter. But that wasn't the worst part. What came next was calculated in a way that required planning. By lunch, Katie carried her tray into the break room where 3 surgical nurses sat at their usual table near the window. She set her tray down with a soft click. The nurses exchanged glances, a synchronized, practiced look that had been refined over weeks. They gathered their containers and moved to the opposite corner of the room without a word, their footsteps deliberate, their message unmistakable. Katie stood alone at the table for a moment, then sat down. She cut her sandwich into precise quarters. She chewed without tasting anything, staring at the wall with the kind of focused emptiness that comes from not letting yourself see what's happening around you. Thunder rolled across Savannah outside the window, dark clouds gathering over the city like an omen nobody acknowledged. The disciplinary notices appeared with the precision of a military operation. First one on a Monday afternoon, posted on the unit board in the main hallway where every staff member passed it at least twice during their shift. Red thumbtack. Black print. Disciplinary notice, K. Morrison, violation of Hospital Protocol HC 891 Section 4, Instrument Handling Protocol Deviation. Documentation of improper sterilization sequencing observed during morning surgical setup, 8:14 a.m. Pierce's signature at the bottom. His title. His authority made visible. Then a second notice appeared 3 days later. This one cited tardiness. Katie had arrived at 6:22 a.m. that morning, 13 minutes early. The notice claimed she clocked in at 7:15 a.m. It referenced Section 2.3 of the Personnel Handbook, an obscure appendix about punctuality standards. She saw it while restocking the surgical supplies, her hands holding a box of sterile gloves, her eyes reading words that were fundamentally untrue. Her fingers briefly formed fists. The box crinkled. Then she released her hands and continued shelving the gloves in their assigned spaces, methodical and careful, as if the notice didn't exist. The third one came within 2 weeks of the first. By then, the pattern had become visible to anyone paying attention. Public humiliation on a schedule. Katie saw it on the unit board while passing through the main hallway, another red thumbtack, another announcement of her failure. This notice cited repeated protocol violations and failure to maintain standard documentation practices. The specific violations were buried in references that Katie knew, when she checked them, were either misinterpreted or invented entirely. Pierce had pulled from the manual with the precision of someone building a legal case against her, assembling paper and dates and accusations like bricks in a wall. In the physician's lounge that afternoon, Pierce spoke to the chief of surgery in a voice loud enough to be overheard. Katie Morrison is developing into a liability we cannot afford. I'm building documentation now. Patient safety demands that we move carefully but decisively. 3 write-ups in 14 days. A pattern is forming. He didn't mention the billing irregularities that her charts had flagged. He didn't mention the surgical supply discrepancies, the amounts that didn't align with actual usage, the vendor orders that appeared on days when no procedures were scheduled. He didn't mention the $30,000 per month that moved from procurement into accounts that existed in the name of someone's brother-in-law in Jacksonville. He simply talked about Katie Morrison as a safety risk, and the chief of surgery nodded, and the decision to build a termination case became official simply by being spoken aloud in the right room. Katie continued her work. Instrument trays prepared. Vitals documented. Supplies restocked. Floors checked. The surgical prep unit ran like a well-oiled mechanism, and she was the mechanism's heart, invisible, reliable, essential. The other nurses continued their coordinated exodus whenever she entered the break room. Pierce continued his public corrections. The disciplinary notices remained on the unit board, accumulating like evidence of failure. Then the code alert sounded at 2:38 p.m. Not a soft chime. A piercing wail that cut through every conversation in every room at St. Michael's, security to OR03, immediate assistance required. Katie was in the supply closet restocking angiocath needles, 18-gauge and 20-gauge in their separate compartments, when the sound hit the hallway outside. She paused for exactly 1 second. Then she moved toward the noise instead of away from it, the way her hands had been trained to move 17 years earlier in a desert where medical supplies were measured in lives saved or lives lost. The operating theater doors burst open and Marcus Webb walked through like something that had broken loose from containment. He was 6'3", 300 pounds, muscle gone thick and strange from disuse and pharmaceuticals, his eyes locked onto a landscape only he could see. A blue hospital bracelet hung loose on his wrist. His discharge papers were probably still in his chart: Army veteran, PTSD diagnosis, prescribed medications, sent into the world with a handshake and a prayer. He wasn't a man anymore. He was a threat made mobile. Where are the doctors who put things in my head? His voice was a roar that echoed off the tile, that bounced off stainless steel instruments and glass panels, a sound like a vehicle engine pushed past its limits. He shoved a scrub tech, a young man named Eric who'd been with the hospital for 8 months, directly into an instrument tray. The crash was enormous. Metal sang against metal. The sound traveled down the hallway and into everyone's nervous system simultaneously. Feet moved. Anesthesiologist first, diving behind the anesthesia cart with the kind of speed that comes from survival instinct. 2 nurses sprinted for the corridor, their footsteps a stampede, one of them grabbing a wall phone to call for additional security. Dr. Pierce backed away toward the physician's lounge, his movements quick and practiced, his hand already on his phone, already dialing, already requesting police and hospital security and whatever else might create distance between himself and the man screaming in the operating theater. The patient on the table, Colonel James Morrison, appendectomy in progress, lay exposed. Surgical site bleeding. Field open. Vulnerable. Nobody had time to cover him. Nobody was thinking about him anymore. The only thought was survival, movement, distance. The hiss of the ventilator continued its mechanical rhythm, indifferent to the chaos. Katie stood in the prep area, 30 feet away, her hands resting on a clipboard full of inventory notes. Everyone else was running. Everyone else had calculated the threat and chosen distance. She watched Marcus Webb for 3 seconds, watched his movements, watched the way fear and chemicals and pain had rewired his body into something predatory, and then she set the clipboard down with deliberate care. Not a drop. Not a clatter. Just a careful placement on the nearest counter. Then she walked directly toward him. Not fast. Not slow. The kind of pace that comes from absolute certainty about what the next moment required. Her voice dropped into a cadence that cut through his screaming like a blade through water, the same voice that had given orders in Ramadi, that had kept for Marines breathing when they should have been dead, that carried the weight of someone who understood that volume was often the least persuasive tool. Marcus. Look at me. You're at St. Michael's. You're safe here. Look at me. He swung. Her body moved. No tension, no hesitation, just a sidestep motion that came from muscle memory deeper than conscious thought. Her right hand caught his arm at the wrist while her left applied pressure to the ulnar nerve point, guiding his 300-pound frame toward the ground with the kind of controlled precision that you only acquired through years of training people how to fall safely. He hit the floor. She moved with him, her voice never rising above that same calm cadence, speaking to him in language that had nothing to do with words, just presence, just the communicated certainty of someone who knew exactly what was happening and was completely in control of it. You're going to sleep now, Marcus. It's safe. You're going to sleep. A surgical resident, courage made briefly visible, pushed 10 milligrams of midazolam 4. The drug crossed the blood-brain barrier. Marcus Webb's eyes began to close. His breathing slowed. His fists unclenched. Katie stayed beside him on the floor, one hand resting on his shoulder, speaking in low tones until the sedative took complete hold and his body became simply a body again, just a man sleeping on the tiles of an operating room. 20 minutes later, Dr. Pierce emerged from the physician's lounge. His phone was still in his hand. His face had regained its professional composure. He looked at Katie kneeling beside Marcus Webb, and he looked at the patient still exposed on the surgical table, and he looked at the chaos of instruments scattered across the floor. What happened next would change everything, though nobody in that operating room understood it yet. Pierce saw an opportunity. What he didn't see was that he'd just made the only mistake that would eventually destroy him. The intercom crackled at 2:48 p.m. Static, then a voice clipped an urgent, security to OR03, immediate assistance required. Not a request. A command. Katie heard it from the prep station, heard the shift in tone that meant something had fractured in the ordinary machinery of the hospital. She didn't look up from the instrument tray she was organizing. 3 anesthesia syringes aligned like soldiers. For sutures in descending order. Everything in its place because chaos came later, always later, and preparation was the only mercy you could give yourself. The doors to the operating theatre were reinforced. Magnetic locks. A security badge required. None of that mattered when Marcus Webb, 310 pounds of discharged Army infantry with a DD5 stamped medical discharge and a bloodstream chemistry that read like a pharmaceutical inventory, simply walked through them like they were made of suggestion. He came through screaming. The sound was animal, all vowels and rage, the kind of noise a human body makes when the wiring has been rewired by IEDs and inadequate VA prescriptions and whatever street cocktail was moving through his neurochemistry at velocity. His eyes were wrong, pupils dilated, jaw clenched tight enough to snap teeth, movements jerky and hydraulic like something operating on a broken processor. "You put things in my head," Marcus screamed at the surgical team. At no one. At everyone. Doctors. Pentagon. Signal in my spine. I know what you did. He shoved the nearest scrub tech, a 23-year-old named David who weighed about 160 and had zero combat experience, directly into the instrument tray. The sound was beautiful and terrible, metal scattering like shrapnel, instruments tumbling across the tile floor with the bright clatter of a dropped ammunition can. David hit the ground hard, wind knocked out, trying to understand how a Tuesday afternoon had become a disaster in the space of 3 seconds. The anesthesiologist, Dr. Chen, meticulous, careful, everything Katie respected, dove behind a cabinet like muscle memory had taken over. Smart. The nurses scattered toward the exits, moving with the instinctive terror of people who understood, suddenly and completely, that the operating theatre was no longer a place of healing. It had become a confined space with a 2-ton threat and no exit strategy. Dr. Pierce locked himself in the physician's lounge and dialed security. Katie heard this later, not from observation but from the way rumors moved through hospitals like blood through arteries. The way she always heard everything, standing still, listening, learning the true architecture of a place through the stories people told when they thought invisible women couldn't hear. Katie moved the opposite direction. Not toward the exits. Not away from Marcus Webb. Directly toward him, her hands loose at her sides, her breathing unchanged, her face a study in controlled indifference that came from 14 years of watching men twice her size convince themselves that size meant victory. She'd seen that particular lie disproven in Ramadi, in a safe house in the Jolan district where a woman with a combat knife and correct pressure point knowledge had walked 3 larger soldiers out of a room alive instead of in a body bag. Marcus saw her coming. His eyes focused on her like she'd suddenly become visible through his rage, like the female in his peripheral vision registered as something worth his attention. His jaw clenched tighter. His breathing hitched. "You," he said. Just one word, but it carried the weight of specific accusation. "Easy," Katie said. Her voice had dropped an octave. The cadence she'd used in firefights, in casualty evacuation, in the moment before small decisions became the difference between recovery and a flag-draped box. "You're safe. Everyone here is on your side. You're the one. You're with them." He swung. Right cross, powerful and untrained, the kind of punch that came from raw strength and not from precision. His shoulder telegraphed the movement 0.3 of a second before his fist traveled, and Katie's body moved like it was remembering something her conscious mind had never been asked to forget. She pivoted, let his momentum carry him past her center line, and in the microsecond when his arm was overextended, when the geometry of his body was vulnerable, she applied pressure, not force, but precise pressure, to the radial nerve cluster just below his elbow. Pain is information. Pain is data. Pain says, stop. Marcus's arm went numb. He gasped, confused, and Katie guided him down to the tile floor with the kind of technique they don't teach in nursing school, the kind that lives in special forces manuals and stays classified because it works with human anatomy the way a key works in a lock. No striking. No breaking. Just understanding. He lay on his back on the cold floor, breathing hard, his confusion mounting because his body had betrayed him. Katie knelt beside him, one hand on his shoulder, her voice still in that low, measured cadence. "Breathe," she said. "You're going to be fine. We're bringing sedation. 30 seconds. You're going to feel tired, and that's okay. That's what's supposed to happen." His eyes focused on her face, and for a moment something human moved behind the rage. Fear, maybe. Recognition that he wasn't fighting anymore, that the threat had resolved not through violence but through something that looked almost like kindness from a woman who should have been running. The sedation came. 15 milligrams midazolam 4, pushed by a nurse with steady hands, and Marcus's breathing slowed, his eyes went glassy, and he became exactly what he'd needed to be 3 minutes earlier, calm, still, safe. Katie kept her hand on his shoulder until his breathing matched the rhythm of the ventilator in the adjacent OR, until the muscle tension drained from his face, until the episode was complete. 20 minutes later, Dr. Pierce emerged from the physician's lounge. His face was controlled, but something underneath was calculating. Something vindictive. He stood over Marcus's sedated body and turned to the security guard who'd finally arrived, now useless, now too late. "I need a full incident report," Pierce said. His voice had that particular quality it took on when he was building documentation. When he was constructing a narrative that had nothing to do with what had actually happened. Nurse Morrison engaged in an authorized physical intervention with an agitated individual. Direct violation of hospital policy HC's 247. Katie had moved to the instrument tray and began collecting the scattered equipment, her face expressionless. Methodical. Each instrument cleaned, each piece aligned, the work of restoration familiar as breathing. She escalated the situation through physical contact. Pierce continued, louder now, performing for an audience. Explicit protocols against this. Patient safety requires action. The chief of surgery arrived because that's what happened when operating rooms became scenes of emergency. Pierce handed him a folder, thick, damning, prepared like he'd been expecting this opportunity his entire tenure. 3 disciplinary notices. The incident report, already filled out in Pierce's careful handwriting, filled with words like reckless and dangerous and unauthorized. A version of events that bore no relationship to what had transpired, but that had the weight of official documentation, of forms signed in triplicate, of a narrative already committed to the hospital record. 3 prior violations, Pierce said. Now this. Patient safety requires immediate action. The chief of surgery looked at Katie. She didn't look back. Just continued organizing instruments with the focus of someone whose job was almost over and who understood this completely. By 6 p.m., Katie's locker had a termination letter. She read it once. One sentence jumped out: unauthorized physical intervention resulting in unnecessary escalation of a security incident. She folded the letter precisely in thirds, the way you'd fold a formal document, and placed it in her bag without emotion registering on her face. In room 312, Colonel James Morrison, Katie's son's commanding officer, the man whose case she'd requested specifically, asked his nurse where Katie was. Post-op haze, pain medication, but something underneath sharp and alert. "She's been reassigned," the nurse said. Morrison's face hardened. He knew. Somehow, he'd already known. He tried to get up, tried to pull at the 4, but the post-surgical pain kept him bound to the bed, kept him from moving, kept him helpless in a way that resonated with something deeper. He lay back, jaw clenched, the expression of a soldier who recognized when the rules had been violated. The next morning at 6:45 a.m., the laundry facility was empty. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like cicadas in summer heat. Katie stood at the folding table, and in her hands was a stack of scrubs, her scrubs, still damp from the autoclave, still carrying the scent of hospital-grade detergent and bleach. She folded each one with the precision of a military flag ceremony. Corners aligned. Edges creased sharp enough to hold an edge. Each fold a small meditation on order, on the restoration of structure in a world that had just collapsed. Her hands trembled only when she thought no one could see. A small vibration in her fingers, a tremor that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with restraint, the physical manifestation of composure held so tight it began to crack at the seams. She placed the folded stack on the counter, 6 shirts high, each one perfect. Each one a goodbye. Her jacket still hung in the locker upstairs. The one with the faded unit patch sewn inside the lining, the one that had been hidden against her ribs for 12 years, the symbol of a rank she could no longer claim, a life she could no longer live. She'd forgotten it, or perhaps she'd left it intentionally, a marker for the person she'd been wearing underneath the invisible woman everyone had learned to dismiss. She walked toward the exit, her badge still clipped to her belt, for now. Outside, the Savannah morning was already hot, already humid, the kind of heat that made everything feel slightly liquid and unreal. The parking lot stretched ahead of her, and she was 2 steps from the door when something occurred to her. She wasn't finished. Not even close. Dr. Pierce emerged from the physician's lounge 20 minutes after the sedatives took hold, his face flushed the color of old brick. His hands trembled as he gripped a clipboard, not from fear, from rage. The operating room had emptied. The patient was stable. The intruder was restrained in the psychiatric hold downstairs. And somehow, inexplicably, a surgical nurse had just become a liability he couldn't ignore. He found Katie in the hallway outside Trauma Bay 3, already removing her gloves with the same methodical precision she brought to everything. She didn't look at him. Didn't acknowledge his presence. This restraint, this infuriating, ice-cold refusal to react, made his jaw clench. He needed her to break. Needed her to defend herself, to contradict him, to give him something he could weaponize. Instead, she simply disposed of the gloves and turned toward the supply closet. "Stop!" His voice sliced through the corridor like a blade on tile. Katie paused. Turned. Her eyes met his for exactly 2 seconds before she lowered her gaze. The posture of deference. The body language of submission. It should have felt like victory. It didn't. "You made an unauthorized physical intervention with an agitated individual," he said, his words clipping like bullets from a practiced speech. Hospital policy HCs 247 explicitly prohibits non-security staff from engaging in restraint or physical contact with psychiatric patients or individuals under the influence. You violated a direct safety protocol. "Understood, doctor." Her voice was flat. Almost automatic. "This is the 4th incident in 14 days. He raised the clipboard, though she wasn't looking at it. "Improper instrument handling. Tardiness. Protocol violations. And now this, assault, Katie. What you did was assault." "Yes, sir." The compliance infuriated him more than defiance would have. He needed her angry. Needed her desperate. Instead, she stood with her shoulders back, her breathing controlled, her face a mask of professional acceptance. A woman who had already decided she was finished fighting. A woman who had nothing left for him to break. He had documentation prepared by 3 p.m. 7 pages, typed on hospital letterhead, citing HCs 247 and invoking the progressive discipline clause. By 5 o'clock, HR had approved the termination. By 6:11 p.m., Katie walked out of the administrator's office with a manila envelope containing her final paycheck, a copy of the severance agreement, and a letter informing her that her termination was effective immediately due to repeated violations of hospital safety protocol. She didn't cry. Didn't argue. Didn't even ask questions. The rain started around 7 p.m., hammering the parking lot in sheets thick enough to erase the streetlights. She stood under the overhang for approximately 90 seconds, watching water cascade off the concrete. Then she walked to her car, a 10-year-old silver Honda Civic, and drove home to her apartment on Victory Drive. She didn't turn on the lights. She sat on the edge of her bed in darkness for 2 hours, listening to the rain. The next morning, she returned to St. Michael's. She didn't sign in. Didn't check in with anyone. She simply walked through the emergency department doors at 6:15 a.m., before the full shift change, and made her way to the laundry facility in the basement. The room smelled of bleach and industrial detergent, a chemical burn that had become oddly comforting over the years. Shelves lined every wall, stacked with folded scrubs in hospital blue, surgical greens, and pediatric prints. A single washer hummed in the corner. She had called ahead, spoken to Marcus, the laundry supervisor, who'd known her for 5 years, and simply said, "I heard. Come by whenever." Katie opened her locker, the same metal box she'd used since orientation day, and removed her scrubs. 4 pairs. All hospital-issued. All belonging to St. Michael's, technically, but Marcus had waved away the formality. She laid them on the long folding table and began to work. The first pair took 8 minutes. She smoothed the top, creased each sleeve into quarters, folded the waist down with a precision that had nothing to do with efficiency and everything to do with ritual. The fabric was soft from hundreds of washings, the blue faded to something closer to grey. She stacked it on the left side of the table. Next pair. Same method. Her hands moved like they were following a choreography written into muscle memory decades ago. The third pair, the one she'd worn in the pediatric wing 2 weeks ago, before Dr. Pierce started writing her up, she held for longer. She ran her thumbs along the seam, checking for stains. Found a small rust-colored mark on the left shoulder. Blood. Probably. Possibly. She didn't clean it. Just folded it with the same care as the others. By the time she reached the fourth pair, the trembling started. Not in her hands. Not where anyone could see. The trembling was in her chest, under the ribs, a tightening that felt like her lungs were learning to breathe differently. She folded. Creased. Stacked. Her jaw stayed locked. Her eyes stayed forward. But something in her sternum was coming apart, cell by cell, like a building scheduled for demolition. The fourth pair went onto the stack. She stood back and examined her work. For perfect rectangles. Hospital blue. Worn fabric. Edges aligned at 90-degree angles. She thought about saluting officers, about folding flags over coffins, about the precision required when you were honoring something that mattered. Her hands shook then, just for a moment, just enough to make the stack wobble, and she gripped the edge of the table to steady it. She was alone. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Marcus was upstairs. No one in the basement. No one watching. So she let her hands shake for exactly 5 seconds. Let her breath come shallow and fast. Let her shoulders curve forward like they wanted to collapse. Then she straightened. Smoothed her civilian shirt. Picked up the stack of folded scrubs and carried them to Marcus's office. "You're sure about this?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "Yeah." She handed over the stack, and he placed it in a donation bin without comment. He was a veteran, Army Logistics, 2003 to 2007, and he understood the language of endings. The ceremonial folding. The refusal to show it breaking you. The walk out the door that looked identical to a walk in the door, except everything inside had changed. Katie left St. Michael's at 6:52 a.m. She didn't say goodbye to anyone. Didn't leave a note. Just walked out into the Savannah morning, where the rain had stopped and the streets were already steaming as the sun climbed over the river. 2 days passed in the kind of grey silence that wasn't quite living. She paid her rent on the 1st. Waited for unemployment paperwork on the 2nd. Spent 12 hours staring at news articles about medical billing fraud that went nowhere, about hospital policies that protected the wrong people, about the specific machinery of injustice that kept working because everyone was too tired or too scared to stop it. She wasn't tired. She wasn't scared. But she was locked inside a civilian life that was built entirely on staying invisible, and the invisible had no weapons, no authority, no standing to fight back. The third day was when the phone call came. Not to her cell phone. To the hospital. To St. Michael's ICU desk. The message came through the afternoon shift nurse, Stephanie, who'd always been kind, that Katie's presence was needed. Not requested. Needed. A trauma alert had come through at 2:22 p.m. Gunshot wound to the shoulder. Middle Eastern patient. No insurance. No identification. And he was asking for her. Katie stood in her apartment for exactly 3 seconds after Stephanie's voicemail finished. Then she moved. Put on the civilian clothes that had started to feel like a costume. Grabbed her car keys. Drove back to the hospital that had fired her 48 hours ago. The ICU was a controlled chaos of monitors and voices and that particular electric silence that comes when people are working at the edge of their competence. Katie slipped past the front desk, no badge, no authority, just a woman in jeans and a grey shirt who moved like she belonged there. The trauma bay was third on the left. She could hear the resident calling out vitals, BP 94/62, dropping. O2 sat 91. Heart rate 128, tachycardic. She stood in the doorway. The patient was a man in his 60s, dark skin weathered by something that looked like decades in the sun, blood soaking through the gauze on his left shoulder. His eyes moved across the faces of the staff, the young resident, the nursing students, the attending who was clearly in over her head with a gunshot wound that required more than textbook protocol, and then his eyes found Katie. He stopped moving. Stopped breathing, almost. His mouth opened, and words came out in Arabic, softly at first, then with more force, Al-Malak al-Aswad. The Black Angel. Katie's body went rigid. Not from fear. From recognition. From the sudden collision of two lives she had spent 17 years keeping separate. The room seemed to pressure around her, air thickening into something that felt almost solid. Every eye in the ICU shifted toward her, confused, waiting for translation, waiting for explanation. Then a Marine in a hospital gown, shoulder bandaged, for in his arm, clearly in the building visiting a family member, sat up on the edge of his bed in the adjacent area. His eyes went wide. He pulled out his phone. "Wait," Katie said. Just one word. Soft. A command. The Marine didn't wait. His fingers moved across the screen, searching, finding, scrolling through something classified that should not have been accessible, should not have existed, but there it was. He started reading, his voice rising over the sound of monitors and alarms. Captain Katie Morrison. 5th Special Forces Group. Silver Star. Bronze Star with Valor. Operation Phantom Fury, Fallujah, 2006. The room went dead silent. The refugee patient's eyes locked onto hers across the ICU, his body rigid against the monitors tracking his wounds. The gunshot had entered below the collarbone, exited through muscle and scar tissue nobody else could read. But he could read Katie's face. His lips moved, barely audible, Al-Malak al-Aswad. The Black Angel. The call sign that had bounties placed on it. The name that was supposed to stay buried in Ramadi dust. Katie's hands didn't shake. Her breathing didn't change. She simply turned and continued her rounds, her movements as measured as someone walking through still water, while the patient's eyes followed her out of the room. That whisper had just broken 18 months of invisibility. That whisper had just cracked the sealed file marked terminated, cause, policy violation HC 247. In the next bay, a Marine stood at his brother's bedside, phone glowing against the grey hospital light, his jaw working like he was chewing something bitter. He'd overheard. Marines always hear what matters. He scrolled, found something, and began reading aloud, his voice cutting through the antiseptic quiet like a blade through silk. Captain Katie Morrison. Silver Star for Valor under fire. Bronze Star with Combat V. For actions during Operation Phantom Fury, Fallujah, 2006, where she performed field thoracotomy under fire and extracted 7 wounded through, he stopped, looked up, and saw her standing frozen in the doorway. His eyes went wide. "That's you. You're her. You're the Black Angel." Dr. Pierce burst through the ICU doors 30 seconds later, his face red, his voice cracking at octaves that made monitors beep faster. Who authorized the discussion of protected medical information? That's HIPAA. That's federal violation. That Marine needs to be escorted from this facility immediately. His hands were shaking. Not from righteous anger. From panic. From the understanding that something he'd carefully calculated was now burning in real time. The Marine didn't stop reading. He kept going, his voice steady and loud enough for the whole unit to hear. Extracted 7 wounded through active sniper fire, distance 470 yards, 3 of those personnel non-combatant civilians. Bronze Star alone, 2007. 2 Purple Hearts. 2008, 2009. He looked directly at Pierce. Your nurse saved 15 people in one operation. You tried to destroy her for doing exactly that here. The phone's glow cast shadows across his face that made him look carved from stone. Pierce stammered about protocols, about chain of command, about patient confidentiality, but his words had become static, meaningless noise from a man whose entire architecture was collapsing in real time. He reached for the phone. The Marine stepped back. Pierce's doctor's coat suddenly looked like what it was, a costume worn by someone who'd never actually proven anything. The two-star general arrived that afternoon, General Marcus Hastings, attending a hospital board meeting about trauma services, moving through the corridor with the kind of presence that made the air pressure change. His uniform was dress blues, crease so sharp it could cut, his shoulders bearing the weight of 240 pounds distributed across 26 years of command. He'd heard. The Marine had called. Word had traveled. The general walked directly into the administrative conference room where Pierce was standing in his white coat, still breathing fast, still believing the rules would protect him. Hastings saluted Katie in the hallway first. Not a casual acknowledgement. A formal military salute, fist to chest, eyes forward, the kind given to officers, the kind that stopped nurses mid-stride and made their breath catch. Captain Morrison. Your service was noted. It still is. Then he turned to the hospital administrator, his voice dropping to that particular register that only senior military uses, the kind that sounds like it's coming from somewhere beneath the floor. I want every document related to this termination. Every email. Every disciplinary notice. Every communication between Dr. Pierce and anyone in administration. I want it by 1600 hours. And I want to know who authorized the retaliation against a decorated officer while she was, and I quote from her medical records, experiencing reintegration challenges that would have been recognized and managed if anyone here had bothered to look. The administrator moved. That's what happened when generals asked for things. People moved. Within an hour, Rodriguez showed up, the IT specialist, a Marine Corps veteran with the kind of calm that only comes from having installed networks in forward operating bases while mortars landed nearby. He preserved something. Something Pierce had tried to erase at 2:14 a.m. the night after Katie's termination notice, thinking the darkness would hide what he was doing. Deleting security footage. Modifying timestamps. Trying to make the whole thing disappear the way he'd wanted to make Katie disappear. Rodriguez played it on the conference room monitor. All three. The interior camera angle showing Pierce in his white coat, alone, hands moving through the supply inventory system, a wireless mouse under his fingers. The timestamp running, 2 hours 14 minutes and 27 seconds. 2 hours 14 minutes and 43 seconds, 2 hours 14 minutes and 59 seconds. His face contorted, focused, terrified. Then he deleted the file. Except Rodriguez had mirrored the server that afternoon. Every frame preserved. Every second backed up. Then Rodriguez scrolled back 3 months. The same camera. Different times, all after hours, all when the surgical schedules were empty. Pierce moving supplies. High-end equipment. Surgical trays. Instruments that appeared on official invoices but never actually showed up in surgical bays. He was moving them somewhere else. Rodriguez had already traced where, a secondary storage facility in West Savannah, under a shell company name, invoiced to St. Michael's but owned by a medical equipment distributor called Meridian Surgical Systems. The federal audit team arrived within 48 hours. They came with spreadsheets, with forensic accountants, with the kind of methodical precision that made financial crime look like what it was, a man trading his oath for $30,000 a month in kickbacks. Inflated billing. Equipment ordered but never received by the hospital. Phantom procedures. Invoices signed by Pierce himself, authorizing charges for supplies that went nowhere except to a man's personal greed. Pierce's lawyer negotiated a plea deal. Not a trial. Not a courtroom where his carefully constructed reputation could be defended by expensive words and reasonable doubt. A plea. An admission. Federal charges for fraud, for kickback conspiracy, for breach of fiduciary duty. His medical license suspended pending investigation. St. Michael's board voted his termination unanimously. The vote took 9 minutes. The discussion took longer than the vote. 6 months passed. Katie stood in her new office, the one with her title printed on the frosted glass, Director of Trauma Services. Her uniform hung in the corner, her white coat, captain's insignia pinned openly now, no longer something to hide under layers of pretense and civilian scrubs. Through the window overlooking the hospital loading dock, she saw it, a white van with MedSupply discount distributors stenciled on the side in fading blue letters. The driver stepped out. Dr. Pierce in a company polo shirt, employee name badge, moving with the jerky self-consciousness of someone who'd fallen so far that the ground was still coming up to meet him. He loaded boxes onto a dolly. Medical masks. For lines. Supplies for hospitals like the one that had employed him, the one he'd tried to steal from, the one that had watched him burn. He glanced up. Katie was watching from the window. She didn't smile. She didn't nod. She simply returned to her paperwork, her captain's insignia catching the fluorescent light like it had finally earned the right to shine. Beneath her diplomas on the office wall hung a framed photo, the faded Special Forces unit patch, the one that had been sewn into her jacket lining, the one a general had saluted. Next to it, a plaque, hand-engraved, the ones who have seen the worst often give the most. The intercom crackled, incoming trauma. 23-year-old male, gunshot wound to the abdomen. ETA for minutes. Katie stood, smoothed her coat, pinned her stethoscope in place. The limp was more pronounced today, her left leg bearing the weight of 16-hour shifts, but it carried her toward the trauma bay where a patient was about to arrive, where someone would need what she knew, what she'd learned in fire, what she'd carried in silence for 18 months while a man in a white coat tried to erase her. She passed the break room. Nurses waved her over. She stopped. She sat down. One of them, Jenny from surgery, spoke first. "We should have asked questions. We should have stood up to him." Katie's voice was quiet, carrying the kind of authority that doesn't need volume. "You're standing now. That's what matters." As she walked to the trauma bay, she could hear the helicopter rotors in the distance, getting louder, getting closer. The sound of backup arriving. The sound of a system that worked when people were brave enough to question it. The sound of a truth that couldn't be buried anymore. This is what heroes look like when the lights go down and the cameras stop rolling. This is what comes next when someone finally stands witness to what was always true. Subscribe and hit the notification bell because these stories keep happening, and someone needs to tell them. Like this video if you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your real value. Comment below, would you have walked toward that threat, or would you have run? The answers matter. They always matter.